Okay, so I've been meaning to make a follow-up video regarding my position on Force the Vote, especially since people conflated my stance against FTV with having a stance against Medicare for All itself. I also recently ran across a bad faith podcast video where Briahna Joy Gray relitigates the Force the Vote situation, and I figured I'd address those, especially since they relate to some confusion my last video caused. Also, I've decided to go ahead and create a Patreon account. I never bothered to monetize this channel, because it was never intended to be more than a side project I could engage with in my spare time, but I suppose if it actually makes some money I can spend more time on this instead of other projects. Okay, so let's unpack a segment from Briahna Joy Gray.
I was listening to Intercepted because my former boss and colleague Ryan Grimm interviewed Pramila Jayapal again. And I was interested to see what she was going to say about the controversy around the $15 minimum wage not being included in the bill. Because if you recall, she also went on Intercepted following the first Force the Vote kerfuffle back in early January to give her rationale for why progressives didn't use the power that they held to withhold their vote for Nancy Pelosi in exchange for any number of concessions. If you recall, they claim that they got pay-go exemptions and certain committee appointments, but of course anything that they claim to have gotten, they could have gotten that plus more by actually forcing the vote and withholding something from Nancy Pelosi. There was a lot that Nancy Pelosi could give in her individual personal discretion, including delegating hearing time for a vote on Medicare for All, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
No, it's not clear that this would have happened, no matter how many times Gray pretends that this is a foregone conclusion. As Ben Burgis pointed out at the time, it's possible that Pelosi could have made a deal with some members of the GOP to secure a few of their votes.
Not at all be against, by the way, just having AOC and the others just vote against Nancy Pelosi just on general principle, just to be like, you know, it's a small gesture, but it might be somewhat ideologically clarifying for casual, you know, news viewers that like, oh, these people are not on the same team. I think there'd be some value to that. I suspect that she'd be elected anyway because knowing Nancy Pelosi, if she lost 5 or 10 or 15 Democratic votes, she would probably make some unspeakably evil vote with, you know, deal with 5 or 10 or 15 Republicans. I'm pretty sure that's how it would play out. But whatever, it might be worth it anyway. But the idea of having this, like, of forcing this symbolic vote on Medicare for All, even on the assumption they could have forced it, never really made sense to me because I think that it was based on a bad analysis of what the problem is right now. Like, why is it that people keep voting for Democrats in primaries who are against Medicare for All?
We also know that Pelosi had trouble securing votes with centrist Democrats. Capitulating to forcing the vote for Medicare for All would have likely lost those more centrist Democrats, with numbers rivaling those she lost in her prior speakership election. Assuming that this happened, that the 4 members of the squad could have generated enough no votes to withhold the speakership, and that Nancy Pelosi didn't make a deal with the GOP. This would have turned this process into a sideshow until Pelosi dropped Force the Vote to secure those centrist Democrats. This could have cost the Democrats the Georgia election as the sideshow continued and people were waiting for their COVID checks. No Georgia, no COVID relief bill. At least not the size of the one we got. We wouldn't be discussing the $2 trillion infrastructure plan that appears to be on the horizon. There are a ton of unknowns here and they could have resulted in far worse outcomes than we have now. People like Joy Gray appear to think reality will conform to their assumptions and that a chain of events would have occurred just as they assume, despite the existence of other likely, often more likely results in each link in this chain of events. What I've noticed about people like Gray is that they pretend there are only 2 possible outcomes. There is the outcome we received, and a much better outcome they claim we would have had received had we followed what almost always seems to be a sketchy tactic. They ignore the possibility of a worse outcome that could have occurred had their tactic not worked. What baffles me is that people really believe that these poorly conceived assumptions amount to actual strategy.
Right, but also, when people say that about Medicare for All, it's like, yes, if I tell you I'm going to serve you a gourmet meal and then poop on the side, you're going to say you don't want the gourmet meal. It's my job to do counter messaging that says, actually, there's no poop on the side. Actually, they're misrepresenting reality. Actually, your taxes are only going to go up less than what you're paying right now in premiums. And there's never, like, obviously, it's a discourse and it's ongoing. And it's our job to keep arguing for the thing. If you are a leftist who is like, oh, well, someone's going to say something negative about Medicare for All that's going to change people's poll responses, therefore I guess it's not that popular anyway. Like, I'm sorry. Like, you need to really reevaluate what side you're on.
Okay, I think Gray's implication is a straw man argument. She's implying the argument is that, because Medicare for All will be harder to sell, once we dive into the details on how to pay for it, support will erode, and therefore we shouldn't even try. If anyone has that take, I think they are wrong. But I don't believe that's the argument. But before I explain the actual argument, let me just say that I, for one, welcome what Gray is referring to as a discourse. The entire point of my channel, at least originally, was to debunk right-wing talking points. Talking points that I once fell for, before I became more informed and outgrew this point of view. If we do reach a point where Medicare for All becomes a national discourse, I will happily create videos debunking the well-paid empty suits. Their hit pieces on M4A would provide me with an endless stream of low-hanging fruit for me to happily debunk. That said, I think when people point to the uphill battle in explaining Medicare for all, they are responding to the faulty argument that, since the phrase Medicare for all polls well, Jayapal's Medicare for all would be an easy sell. Therein lies the fallacy. It's true that the phrase Medicare for all polls well, but it's clear that respondents don't necessarily have Jayapal's Medicare for all in mind. Many respondents assume they'd be able to keep their current health insurance. It's also clear that respondents actually respond more positively to a public option, and the Democratic base prefers to build onto the ACA than to start a new healthcare program. I say this, not to argue that those are better options, but to point out one of the flaws in the force the vote argument. Proponents argued that Democratic legislators who voted down M4A would then be vulnerable to be primaried. But this is false, given that they would have the excuse that they simply supported the options that polled even better. They would also have on their side the endless onslaught of anti-M4A arguments, and proponents would face the uphill battle of explaining away the endless bullshit claims. And keep in mind, we are talking about elections that would likely take place in very purple districts, not solidly blue districts where elected officials can safely vote yes on M4A. Consider that Georgia was won by 2 Democratic senators who don't support Medicare for all. In fact, Ossoff seems vocally against it. Consider that Elizabeth Warren's numbers began tanking when she finally explained how she would pay for Medicare for all. Why? Because, unlike Bernie's key demographics, Warren's voter base demanded details on how to pay for it and weren't okay with the taxes, even though she claimed taxes would only rise for the top 1% and for businesses who would now pay into Medicare instead of private health insurance companies.
I have a plan for Medicare for all, and I'm proud that it's the first health care plan by anyone in this presidential primary that lays out the full cost and how to pay for it. And here's the deal. It doesn't raise middle-class taxes by 1 penny, not 1 penny. If we make no other changes over the next 10 years, Americans will reach into their pockets and pay out about $11 trillion on insurance premiums, copays, deductibles, and uncovered medical expenses. My plan reduces those costs to zero, sort of like an $11 trillion tax break. So we have 2 choices. We can maintain the status quo that leaves 24 million uninsured, leaves 63 million with substandard care, and forces Americans to ration medicine and turn to GoFundMes. Or we can spend slightly less on Medicare for All, which covers everyone, ensures long-term care for our seniors, and puts $11 trillion back in the pockets of the people by eliminating premiums, copays, and deductibles. For middle-class families, that means thousands of dollars back in your pocket every year. Under my plan, existing federal and state spending on health care stays the same. For middle-class families, there'll be no new taxes. Look, you're already paying into Medicare and Medicaid, so you're done. No new taxes, no new costs. Business spending on healthcare also stays about the same. Payments just go to Medicare instead of to private insurers. That's about $9 trillion in the next 10 years. And we make up the rest largely with taxes on big corporations and the top 1%.
Here's another factoid. Do you know who else has been pushing for the Democrats to vote on Medicare for all? The GOP. In early 2019, they were looking into their own version of Force the Vote, thinking they could use this to sow division within the Democratic Party and fearmonger about socialism. Here is an excerpt from the article.
GOP lawmakers, fresh off an electoral shellacking fueled in large part by health care concerns, are now trolling Democrats with demands for hearings on the sweeping single-payer bill set to be introduced this month. They're confident that revelations about its potential cost and elimination of most private insurance will give them potent lines of attack heading into 2020, an election that President Donald Trump is already framing as a debate about socialism. We should have the opportunity to have a hearing on a bill Democrats say they are for, Oregon Representative Greg Walden, the top Republican on the House Energy and Commerce Committee, told Politico. They've campaigned on it. Now, let's find out what it is and what they're promoting. We're going to pull the curtain back on Medicare for all so the American people can actually assess it, added Representative Kevin Brady of Texas, the top Republican on House Ways and Means. The Republicans' counterintuitive move seeks to exacerbate real divisions within the Democratic Party on how far and how fast to move beyond Obamacare and chart a course toward Medicare for all. Senior Democrats leading the House's health committees blasted the GOP request as cynical and disingenuous and said it would not affect their timeline for weighing the policy.
In other words, this is a nice soundbite.
Also, when people say that about Medicare for all, it's like, yes, if I tell you I'm going to serve you a gourmet meal and then poop on the side, you're going to say you don't want the gourmet meal. It's my job to do counter messaging that says, actually, there's no poop on the side. Actually, they're misrepresenting reality. Actually, your taxes are only going to go up less than what you're paying right now in premiums. And there's never, obviously, it's a discourse. And it's
And it's very easy to say on a podcast or to type into a tweet. Implementing it in the real world, disabusing people of decades of deeply ingrained brainwashing, while competing with contradicting messages from well-funded sources that only need to obfuscate the truth and cause confusion and fear, is a different story altogether. I think that this is what confuses some people on the left. If you only engage with other people on the left, it's easy to fall into a false sense of reality, in regards to how messaging is received. The online atheists from a decade and a half ago made the same mistake. They assumed that simply sharing facts would get people to let go of beliefs they had, beliefs which were often tied to their culture and familial traditions. The same thing happens with politics. As someone who has lived in small conservative towns, I can attest that it takes more than explaining facts to people. At least most of them. To this day, I have friends and acquaintances who hold on to deep right-wing beliefs, and this includes people who have found themselves in positions in life where things like Medicare for all would benefit them, and their family. They've heard every argument I've made on this channel, and every fact that eventually led me to my political positions today. You'd be surprised at the ridiculous arguments people cling to in order to hold on to their confirmation bias. The reason I even created this channel was to reach people who hold some right-wing beliefs, but only due to a lack of knowledge, and are open-minded and can be persuaded through facts. Those people can be reached through facts. People who are psychologically married to ideological positions are a different story altogether, especially when the majority of their quote-unquote research is spent on sources that will reaffirm their existing biases. If you notice, the progressive channels that seem convinced that FTV was a viable strategy tend to be channels that never engage the right in debates, nor spend any time actually unpacking and debunking their arguments. They stay within a progressive silo and never do the hard work of deconstructing well-crafted, albeit ultimately false arguments. The channels that oppose FTV are the channels that actually engage right-wingers. They actually understand why and how people have opposing views. They understand that people are complex and are motivated by countless factors. I would argue that the channels that actually engage the right are the channels that are ultimately helping progressive causes the most. Why? Because they are reaching people outside of left-wing circles and converting some of those people, thereby growing the left-wing pie while making the other pie smaller. They are disabusing people of reactionary beliefs, comfortably preaching to the choir and playing armchair critic while providing fallacious arguments and false assumptions won't grow the pie. It only misleads people who are already part of the left. Oddly enough, the pro-FTV channels seem to spend their time and energy attacking the party, where the majority of legislators actually support progressive policies and avoid criticizing the party that unanimously opposes progressive policies, and would completely privatize healthcare if given the chance. And I have to restate that forcing a vote on Medicare for all appears to originate with the GOP. They believe that they could paint supporting Democrats as scary socialists, while simultaneously splitting the left. It should go without saying that the GOP doesn't secretly wish and believe that this would have actually fast-tracked Medicare for all. They clearly believe that they could win the information war, given the deeply entrenched beliefs most people hold and the uphill battle involved in battling those beliefs. Why are people like Jimmy Dore so adamant on the same strategy, as he constantly lambastes the Democrats while giving Republicans a pass? And remember when Dore said that he hoped Bernie lost, simply because he went on to MSNBC instead of his own show.
Just outright talking about how he's salty that he won't come on his show.
Party is not letting this happen.
Even Bernie Sanders, right? We've been trying to get Bernie Sanders on the show. And, his campaign has just got their head up their ass. And they can't wait to go on Chris Hayes and Rachel Maddow, who shit on them every frickin' time. But someone who actually supports them is going to help to get their message out. They shun them. I hope you effing lose again.
Does that sound like someone who's really concerned with people having health care? What's more, is it made perfect sense for Bernie to go onto MSNBC because their viewers are the people he needed to convince. If Dore really cared about seeing Bernie expanding his voter base, he would have supported Bernie's decision. I want to be clear, just because I think force the vote was a nonsensical idea that was never going to achieve the goals its proponents alleged, but which did help said proponents gain a larger following, doesn't mean I oppose Medicare for all itself. I just don't believe this alleged tactic would have brought us anywhere closer to it, and would have almost certainly sabotaged the progress that has been made. I also think it's causing a rift in the left that, if anything, just helps the GOP. Accusing elected officials of being corrupt for not pursuing quote-unquote tactics that were never going to advance Medicare for all and would possibly prevented people from getting their COVID checks doesn't help the left. Also, it seems impossible to speak out against force the vote without being labeled as pro-Biden. If you look at my channel history, I was a Yang, then a Sanders supporter. I only supported Biden insofar that he was a better option than Trump. So as for my opinion of Biden, that's a work in progress. I will have a more solid position in late 2022, when the window will have closed for passing the more ambitious goals. What I'm not going to do is pretend that Biden has failed us, simply because he hasn't passed everything that progressives want before the season finale of The Walking Dead. By all means, we should be skeptical, but this addiction to leaping to every event as an opportunity to claim that the sky has fallen seems ridiculous, and I can't help but think it's little more than pandering. The squad wasn't willing to gamble with Pelosi's nomination and the Georgia seats in order to force a vote on a bill that had no chance of passing? Let's call them the fraud squad. Democrats aren't willing to gamble with the COVID bill by insisting on a minimum wage increase that can always be fought for later, after people have received their checks. This proves they'll never raise the minimum wage. I mean, if the quote-unquote Democratic establishment is as corrupt and far removed from the people's interests as these channels claim, it should be more than enough to simply report what they do and call balls and strikes. Rather, these channels have a habit of trying to call the entire game after the third pitch. As we know, there exists a cottage industry around serving cheap dopamine hits, making good money doing so while pretending to be an average Joe just like the people in your audience. It's a good grift, but it doesn't help advance progressive causes. Here is Michael Brooks addressing this cottage industry. Michael, were he alive, would be against force the vote. Why? Because he actually cared about advancing progressive causes and wasn't just clout chasing.
So intentionally saying, I'm going to take a situation, and by the way, this is not somebody who is saying in the middle of the country who's like, look, I've been fucked over by the political establishment. I've been abused by players on both sides, and I'm done. I'm through with it. I'm not voting. Or maybe I've been sucked in by the Trump scam, or maybe I'm doing a protest vote. I have no judgment for those people. No comment. But if you're a political commentator sitting on your ass in LA who doesn't do basic research and is playing with people's lives because of a fantasy scenario in your head about what could be, that has been debunked. This is middle school gossip and your fantasy life. It's not politics. Dude, if you want to do politics, you got to fucking understand the issues. It's not all just emotions and fantasy life. Or if you want to do emotions and fantasy life, then own it and just do critique, and that's great. But don't call people who actually care about the process and bother to do some fucking research dummies because they look at things a little bit structurally. It's an easy hustle. It's an easy market. It's an easy game. But it's not contributing to anything. It's not going to help us win. And to me, it seems like, if anything, at this point, this is helping Trump. If we have to fight neoliberals, we have to fight Trump, we have to fight establishment Democrats, we have to deal with the corporate hegemony, we have to deal with ideological conformity of a global elite, do we really need to spend our time on YouTube just giving people dumb emotional releases? Or actually help them think about how they actually get power? And I know that that was spoken like a true fucking corporate sellout. The fuck out of here, man. Do some research. Get serious. And don't be a coward. You didn't mention my name. You haven't had Sam on your show. Engage.